so that we can share this with the world. Hi everyone, Mick Liubinskas here from Climate Salad. Thank you so much for joining. A really amazing group of people here. Love we've got so much interest and passion around climate technology. And one of the best things about it for me has been being able to connect with and meet people who are also passionate about this space and who are investing their time, resources, experience. And one of those people I've met over the last year is Phoebe from Blackbird Ventures. Phoebe, it's been great to get to know you, and I'd love for you to give a quick introduction and we can dive into some of the big topic areas.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. Kia ora koutou katoa. Hello to everyone, whether you're coming from Australia or New Zealand. If you're coming from Melbourne, I hope you haven't been too shaken by this morning's events. And I'm thinking of you from, we have a lot of experience in New Zealand with those sorts of earthquakes, and that you never get used to it. So I'm thinking of you all today. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. So as Mick said, I'm an investor. I work at Blackbird, and I'm based in Auckland, where we have actually just two of us at the moment investing a $60 million fund in Kiwi founders. And I'm part of the bigger Blackbird investment team, which sits across Australia and New Zealand. I actually joined Blackbird only about 6 months ago. Prior to that, I was in London for the last 5 years and in Melbourne for 2 years before that. So I'm a little bit new back to Aotearoa and to both the kind of startup and technology landscape here, also getting my head around everything from how the government operates with technology startups and in the climate space, through to who the kind of complete village of people here in Aotearoa is. So the perspectives that I'm going to share today are kind of my observations as a relative newbie back to Australia and New Zealand, and should be taken with a grain of salt because I'm still getting my head around it too.
Amazing. Yeah, certainly I've seen just incredible changes on so many fronts over the last few years. You've had a change of geography, a change of role, and you've seen some of that change. I'd love to start with that, like clean tech to climate tech, philanthropy impact, changes to be just main business as usual now. Have you seen that adjustment already happen, or are we still in flux? And what do you see are the biggest changes that we have now, which we didn't have a few years ago?
Yeah, lots to cover there. I think if I think about my career, when I started working, it was in Melbourne for Bain & Company as a strategy consultant. And one lunchtime I went along to hear Dan Madhavan talk from, he was at Impact Investing Group then. And he talked about kind of this idea of combining non-financial objectives with investment, with finance. And that to me was such a light bulb moment. It was like, oh my gosh, that's so obvious. If only you could have that kind of lockstep impact with every financial decision you made, like how quickly could we create a more efficient, effective, sustainable, customer-friendly world. And that idea was relatively new, and I think has now become very mainstream. So even in my relatively short career to date, the idea that businesses exist not just to deliver financial returns to investors, and instead need to consider all of their stakeholders. That sort of idea of ESG, broadly construed, is something that is relatively recent history, but is now, I think it does have mainstream adoption. And when I finished up at Bain and became an investor working at Generation, that is a fund that was set up by Al Gore and a group of partners from Goldman Sachs back in about 2002. So a long time ago now. And they set up that firm with this belief that if you looked at the elements of a business, not just its financial returns, but also its governance practices, whether the very business model that it was relying on would be around in 50 years, whether it managed its supply chain in a way that was consistent with that sort of generational ownership. That whole perspective was like completely iconoclastic in 2002, 2003, and now it's 100% mainstream. So that kind of theory of change that they set out and founded Generation along has kind of come to fruition. Now, what's interesting is, and I, did not live as an investor through clean tech 1.0, but definitely inherited some of the wisdom or maybe scars from that period while I was at Generation working in the growth equity, private investing team. it seems that we are in a very exciting second wave of climate technologies, call them, where there's so much more availability of capital, there's supportive policy. I just saw earlier this morning that Xi Jinping has announced no no overseas funding for coal projects globally, which is an incredible milestone and puts a lot of pressure on that whole sector. So, a lot of support from different areas for decarbonisation and technologies that can help achieve that. And the capital inflows are significant. So a lot of traditional high quality asset managers, venture capital funds are creating dedicated climate funds. You have, everyone from Robert Downey Jr. to Bill Gates standing up specific funds. And that's creating a really interesting conditions, which I'm sure we'll get into, about the number of companies that are being funded, the variety of technologies. And it's a very exciting time to be operating in the space, no matter what your interests are.
And I'd love to drill down in that from two angles. One is you've got BlackRock and Gates and billions of dollars and trillions of dollars up here. And then you've got startups in New Zealand. So how do you go, but we need those startups to go to global impact. And to do that, we kind of need the money to get down to the startups. Like, how do both of those things happen in a fast enough way to solve these big problems? And how do you see them from your lens in New Zealand at the moment?
Yeah, good question. I think let's not confuse the sort of responsible investment movement, which applies to, listed companies of all sorts, and private companies too, that the kind of BlackRocks, and I mean, it's arguable whether they've got a good track record on that front, but they've at least talked a lot about that being important. There's kind of that, which is like responsible investment being almost a baseline requirement now. And then separately, there's kind of how do you scale innovative, novel climate technology solutions. Historically, there was a real problem in, first of all, attracting venture capital. So, high risk tolerance, early stage investment money to support the prototype stage of climate technologies. Then there was, and I think that stage of things is starting to resolve. So, Blackbird, where I now am, when by no means a climate focused fund, but we have some outstanding climate focused founders in our portfolio, the likes of SunDrive, who are making incredible progress. Or Bardi, who is the best company you've probably never heard of because they've been in stealth, or Energy Bank, which I invested in New Zealand.
Tim's on the call, I think. So that we'll be aware of that. But that's good to have him here.
I would only ever say nice things. And so I think that initial stage of injecting that high risk, I guess, capital to the point into founders at that stage where they kind of move from ideation to prototyping, that sort of part of the capital journey seems relatively well resolved in New Zealand. You have dedicated deep technology funds, the likes of Outset Ventures, who also provide office space, R&D space. You have Nuance Capital, who are focused on deep tech innovation. But then you also have kind of mainstream venture capital funds like Icehouse, I'd put Blackbird in that bucket, who can see, shiny, ambitious, world-changing founders creating ideas in this space like Tim. I think the interesting challenge is, because I think it's also a time and place thing, where that's probably true of the last 2 or 3 years. And what is going to be a challenge is the next phase. Once some of these innovative technologies move beyond prototype stage, they need to look globally for customers. They need to scale manufacturing. They need to build very significant manufacturing plant in certain places, like that kind of project capex, or bigger checks with probably still a lot of patience. Rather than a traditional debt facility, that kind of type of capital, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out for Australian and New Zealand companies and it's a really important and problematic valley of death that needs to be overcome for our companies to be successful. So you do see Generation itself, where I was previously, is innovating they're about to announce a fund that will cover that kind of opportunity where there's a very promising technology. It's not yet at commercial scale, and there's an opportunity to provide patient more debt-like, funding for scale up. But that's probably the next opportunity in the capital stack where there's not so much supply. Hopefully that will change. And I'd be interested in any perspectives from you, Mick, or from anyone in the room around that sort of next, growth phase of capital, where you have capital intensive hardware, which is, describes, I guess, most of climate tech that we're talking about.
It is a really interesting question. I think I would have hoped for this kind of change in the world and movement of capital and entrepreneurship and research and those things. I think that's really positive. And I think Michael Mollett, who's also on the call as a climate scientist, speaks a lot about how important the next 3 years are, because we can't wait till all actions we do in the next 3 years have a massive positive impact on where we are at the end of this decade. So that action is really critical. But even with my best crystal ball, it's really hard to see how all those components fit in together. And it goes to that last point you raised about deep tech and hard technology, science tech. When you think about focus in this area, between SaaS, which we've got pretty good models on, and Blackbird's got an outstanding reputation with growing those companies from New Zealand and Australia globally, and you can see how they would scale, to Energy Bank, which is like, doing an update of Culture Amp versus doing an update of Energy Bank as a product. Like, they are just materially different things. But SaaS is not going to solve all of our problems. We need to do some of that hard stuff. And speaking to Andrew Rogers, an angel investor in the space, and we're like, wow, how do we get our heads around understanding the path of these companies? Clean tech's not going to be exactly the same. Given that Blackbird's not 100% climate tech focused, is there a layer that's still the same, which is outstanding co-founding team solving a big problem? I don't care how the technology is or the capital requirements, will work that out. Or do you think it's going to be, we won't do ag, or we won't do transport, we'll only do these kind of things because we've got to get deep in it? Or do you think there might be another lens by which we want to filter and understand the opportunities?
Yeah, I think that Daniel Ek at Spotify characterizes the difference in these business models between like a preference for investing in bits or a preference for investing in atoms. And I think what you're seeing among many venture funds is an increasing interest in atom-based investments. So Blackbird has long actually invested in hardware innovation. Zoox was an early investment, full stack autonomous robo vehicle. We've invested in space companies, medical device companies across the board. And that's one of the reasons, one of the strong reasons that I joined Blackbird, because it's the lens is not really about business models or industries or sectors, although we definitely have some strengths, as you say, in kind of bottom-up SaaS and other areas. What the lens that we really bring is about founders finding people who are doing their life's work and who really understand a problem and are developing a solution that is a compelling answer to that problem, such that it will change their customer's life. And people that are customer obsessed, problem-led rather than solution-led, they are solving all sorts of problems. And so we are much more, particularly in New Zealand, super agnostic as to what people are doing. It's much more about understanding the people themselves, their motivations, how deeply they've gone on the customer journey to understand the problem and the solution that they're creating. And I think it's interesting if you imagine a paradigm, challenging hardware innovation in climate technology, like maybe Mint innovation in our portfolio, as well as Energy Bank. It's those things it's harder to see the clues about customer obsession, and because it may be many years before you can sell something to a customer. But what I loved about Tim is that he'd already done that work to talk to all of the potential customers and understand what they need and kind of try and work backwards from that to create a solution. So I would say the things we look for in founders don't really differ too much between business models. It's always about customer obsession, a high, technicolor product vision that will deliver an amazing experience for that customer that's 10 times better than the status quo, and people who are, seeking to do their life's work and build companies that for ideally 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's they're really good points. I think the bits versus atoms is a great way to frame it. The one thing you touched on is the difference of bottom-up sales. Again, I won't say it's easy, but you can build a company in Australia, New Zealand, sell it online, people put in their credit card details, like the tools around that are pretty known, versus again, a Fable or Val Foods or V2 Foods or an Energy Bank or an MGA Thermal. The sales cycle, the go-to-market model is harder, and a big part of what my drive, and Charlotte will attest to this with Climate Salad, is help them get customers. Customers solves a lot of your problems. But that model of experimentation to find product market fit, even, and then the scalable model, they're quite different. And have you found you need either different skills in the core team or different skills around you at Blackbird to support those companies that have more complex go-to-market models, or is that something that in climate tech we're still laying the track down on?
Maybe it would be a good time to define climate tech as well, because I think of it very broadly, because I know we've got Nada on the call as well. I mean, for example, there are a lot of really interesting consumer models. You mentioned Val and Fable. Like, in a sense, they've actually got very known, well-worn paths to market around, distribution through grocery retail. And so the challenge there is not so, they have a very different challenge, which is very much on the scaling, obviously, creating a prototype that works, scaling supply chains for the right inputs, and then manufacturing at a sufficient scale that they can meet a kind of unit economics price that makes sense for a grocery shopper.
Yeah.
So those things they're a little different in the sense that they're bringing novel technologies to food production that, the food system, that whole idea is relatively recent. Previously, it was sort of just like, repackaging different commodity ingredients in different ways and spending a lot more time on brand and marketing. Now it's investing a lot more upfront in creating a product that's differentiated and lower emissions. Whereas, sure, for other business models, but I would say it's not climate tech specific. We have Gilmore Space in our portfolio that are building rockets in the same way that Rocket Lab builds rockets. Yet they have very different go-to-market challenges to Val. I think with a lot of climate tech, it's a sweeping statement, but in most cases, there's such clear market need for decarbonisation options that if you do understand a problem that exists and a customer persona or profile that has that problem, and you build something that hasn't existed before and solves their problem, they actually will buy it. So it's like if it's trying to sell a new mushroom burger is in a sense harder because there are other burgers available. Trying to sell a medium long duration energy storage solution, if it works, give 10 years, then like that is 100% got customers, because you can go and talk to energy retailers, renewable energy owners, and they will grab it with both hands. So it's maybe a little simplistic, just a model, but the go-to-market should resolve itself. I think the bigger challenge with these fundamental climate technologies is a little more it's the manufacturing scale-up piece, which is going to
that's a really interesting lens. I hadn't thought about that Fable need to change consumer behavior. I'm a committed person. I've got Fable in my fridge right now, but that's a change thing, whereas other things are just filling new gaps which didn't even exist. Same thing around carbon pricing, and it's green space versus red space, actually, like trying to get a Midwest American to have a mushroom burger over a hamburger is going to be a challenge. So
the other way to think about it is, in a sense, like most things are going to be climate technologies, because decarbonisation touches every element of the economy. So there are very few categories. I know it was Dave earlier on the call saying that he's working on a decarbonisation pathway for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
So, literally every element of the economy has challenges around sustainability, and that creates opportunities for entrepreneurs of all stripes to bring things to market. But yes, they will have different challenges depending on what exactly they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Everything has carbon or consumes carbon in some ways, and has costs of the environment, which we need to be aware of. That goes to another area I'd like to dig in on, is the level of impact. So, I was talking to someone just before about, Google's do no harm. Okay, it's not negative, but it's not a positive. There are companies that are kind of supportive and indirectly beneficial, and there are companies who are like sucking out carbon from the air and turning it into, putting it underground. So in terms of direct, I took a ton out of the sky. How do you evaluate that? Are you looking for like really concrete, what is your projected, the Bill Gates breakthrough, you need to be pursuing 1% of the whole problem? And are you okay with things which are indirect or passive, more passive in terms of their impacts?
Yeah, I think this comes down to how different investors operate, what their focus is, how they would talk about their unique service proposition, and the way that they've talked to their own clients about what they're doing. So if I think about Generation where I was previously, the whole USP there was we look globally for companies who, through business model and technology innovation, are making the world more efficient, more sustainable, along sort of the lines of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we would just look for businesses that were reducing greenhouse gas emissions or improving human health outcomes or financial inclusion. And so we would judge ourselves by whether our portfolio companies were kind of having impacts along those lines. With greenhouse gas emissions, it's actually relatively easy to track impact. And so in a sense, it's also easy to say we've got a threshold above which that we consider that impactful enough or not to spend our dollars on. There's a lot of interesting work about dollar return on impact that the likes of the Rise Group has done. And that's a really legitimate way to be a responsible or an impact-focused fund. And I think it's really important for many funds to do that and hold themselves to a high standard around where they'll spend their time and money. With Blackbird, again, we're not an impact fund. We're founder-led, and we believe in investing in companies that we hope will change the world over decades. And you could say that Canva is a more impactful company than many in our portfolio, in the sense that they've got 50-60 million monthly active users who kind of use it to run their own businesses, which themselves have many positive impacts. Mel and Cliff have committed a third of their equity, I think, to invest directly in projects like Give Directly. And so impact's a tricky topic. I think what I hope, I guess my theory of change personally is if you invest in solutions that make the world more efficient, allow for more efficient uses of resources, improve people's lives, the ways that industries operate, and they're good businesses, and those founders are going to go the distance to create enduring companies, then you'll have lockstep impact as those companies scale. So almost, it's like, of course, there's a trade-off, but really awesome impact at low scale is not as good as a little bit less impact. I mean, yeah, it actually makes me think about at Generation, one of our portfolio companies was Asana, and or is Asana still in the portfolio? And when we did the kind of greenhouse gas impact reporting out on our portfolio, they came out as one of the strongest contributors, which sounds really weird, but if you have even very small assumptions about a tool like that enabling remote collaboration and stopping people taking so many meetings in the office, this is pre-COVID, the actual magnitude of that investment was significant because it's such an amazingly successful company. So impact's an interesting topic.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I can see you grappling with a lot of things that we're all grappling with, I think. And there's going in a good direction, and then some of them are easier to measure in hindsight. But it's a little bit like founders estimating their 5-year cash flow forecast, right? Of like, some of them are going to be much bigger and some of them might be smaller, but we need kind of everything right now, right? So it's okay if we work that out. But yeah, where you draw the line, I think, is definitely tougher sometimes. So and there is a trade-off of scale and impact as well. Like a little bit of impact globally for 1 billion people is massive, whereas some people will have I can replace one coal-fired plant with wind turbines. That's locally, individually huge, but not globally huge. So it's such a big trade-offs.
Yeah. And I guess the hope is that there are capital pools available for all these different kinds of interventions. But there may also be, I don't have a good example that comes to mind, but maybe you do, where a business model has many positive attributes, but then has some negative ones. Maybe it relies on rare metals or and therefore extractive industries to build its widgets.
I think Kate's saying shipping. I think there are big hard things to solve, like shipping and long haul flights as well. And there are things which I think have to be step changes. So we can't jump straight to perfectly sustainable environment without massive impacts on the world and health and other things. And I've got 2 quick questions before I open up to the audience. So please hit the raise your hand function if you'd like to ask Phoebe a question. But one of them relates to that, which is incumbents and big organizations participating in this. We can't completely disrupt them and ignore them. But for a startup, if a startup either wants to have a partnership or a customer or maybe strategic investment from an incumbent, do you see that as what are your thoughts around incumbents participating in the innovation and startup space?
As customers, they're really important. And can be, we didn't really talk about this yet, but obviously incumbent companies that have a lot of pressures to decarbonize their own operations or supply chains, they're going to be important pull factors for a lot of the climate technologies that are being innovated by startups. The question of strategic investment is always a tricky one. I guess in my experience, corporate investors don't often live up to the promise in terms of being really helpful and kind of providing the input or strategic advice and introductions and so on that they might promise. Of course, that's a really blanket statement, but I suppose for any founders who are considering taking strategic investment, it's worth considering, like, is equity the best way to buy that advice? I guess what we would see often is the best companies that have the best products can get that love input advice from their customers without having to give equity. So sometimes it's a red flag. It's like,
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to think about it. Is you're trading equity for that. What are you hoping to get, and is there another way to get it?
Yeah, because equity is the most expensive option always.
That's right. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, though, I think what's different maybe about like this clean tech period is there is a lot more vocal pull from large corporations for this technology innovation. So I was hearing last week about Fortescue Metals wanting to, create a hydrogen powered trucking fleet of its massive mining vehicles.
Yeah,
they may be able to create opportunities for companies in that space that wouldn't exist if they had to rely on market price of hydrogen and renewable energy and the inputs required to come down to a certain point. Instead, they need almost like to get a foot on the ladder by having those corporates effectively subsidize because they're so important for them from a shareholder perspective and in a sustainability, should we be around as a business perspective to make this happen. So it'll be interesting to see whether some of those tipping points start happening and kind of giving a leg up to innovative technologies that need to get down that cost curve.
Yeah, I think that's right. I see definitely a big difference between Blockbuster participating on streaming videos versus this, where based on the clear risk of them not participating, but that also doesn't mean they are they can still be a great partner for startups. So I think it's good that they're participating and asking the questions, but yeah, definitely ask your own questions about that value. Last question before I go to Michael on a question. Women in climate tech. I've been a big supporter of women in entrepreneurship generally. I think there's amazing women in research, and we've got some amazing female founders in Climate Salad, Juliet and Yaz and others. Do you see it as a combination of a new opportunity in a big space and some real natural talents around research and science, and that there's a real opportunity for women to play a bigger role in climate tech than they have in tech? Or any thoughts on what you've seen either in New Zealand in terms of good things in that direction?
Yeah, look, diversity in all its forms is still a challenge throughout the tech landscape. I would say clean tech looks more or less the same. I don't think there's any sort of major differences. If you think about the sort of broad construction of climate tech as including everything from consumer models through to sort of deep technologies, that's definitely true. One actually thing I read last week was that only 20% of Australian startups that were funded in the first half of the year have a female founder, which is shockingly low. But the average round size of the rounds that they raised was $17 million versus 10. So somehow they're like, raising more money, perhaps at a later stage. And, who knows what the actual causation is there. I thought that was interesting.
Nice. I saw another stat that said VCs typically discount projections from female founders by only 15%. And male founders by 50%, because so there's clearly a lot more honesty and integrity in female founders' projections. So
yeah, so I think the issues are ones that are kind of true across the technology landscape, and it is hard to say exactly what the causation of those low founder participation rates are, and I'd be interested actually to hear from the group about their perceptions. But there are some, what helps is having amazing female founder role models who come from very, range of different backgrounds, range of personality types and spikes. So technical co-founders as well as CEOs, and seeing that people have been successful. So in our portfolio, I think Phoebe Gardner, who's the CEO of Bardi, she's an architect turned founder, she's about 25, is just an incredible example. And actually Olympia as well, who's pursuing a kind of a similar, in a similar category actually, also stand out. You have Catherine at Bright, some great examples, and there's many more who are operating different business model approaches, but in some way part of the decarbonisation story here in New Zealand or Australia. And then I do think it's important to have female investors, because that also makes the conversation, or just potentially makes a more comfortable environment, maybe a perception that you're not always in rooms where you're the only woman. And so we've got some amazing climate-focused female investors like Lucy at Grok or Imcha here in New Zealand at Outset. I think that does help, but I have no doubt, there are many more structural challenges that exist, and we shouldn't just be focused on gender diversity either. So I'd love to hear any perspectives around the room on that one.
Yeah. Let's try to a question. Michael, jump in with your first question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mick. Thanks, Phoebe. And as the father of two young daughters, they're 8 and 5. I'm heartened to see so many women doing so well in this area. In fact, it says Olivia Molitor next to my name because my 8-year-old, who is much more digitally savvy than I am, has been using my phone for Zoom calls, and I just realized that her name is there. Look, here's my concern. First of all, I'm gobsmacked by the number of funds, VCs launching climate tech funds. It's fantastic, right? And the people that I meet, and Mick has been fantastic. I've met an extraordinary group of people. We are attracting some really outstanding people. That's a fantastic sign. But here's my concern. I've got 2 young daughters. I wake up every day and think about, are we going to maintain climate system stability, right? And I see all this money being poured into climate tech. And there seems to be a mismatch between investments which are leading to improvements in our odds of not destabilizing the climate system, right? But improving resource productivity. So when I look at food, when I look at stationary energy and transport, the reason why climate tech is a great thing to invest in is those areas are horrible. They're terrible. I mean, you couldn't invest, if I gave you $50,000, you couldn't create a food system that's worse than what we have, right? So if I'm a VC, the opportunity to improve food production, even without CRISPR and synthetic biology, is absolutely massive. So here's what I expect to see trillions of dollars chasing resource productivity improvements, right? And they're going to make good money. You know, the LPs are going to do well. The founders are going to do well, and all those things should happen. But there's a complete mismatch between climate tech investments and the problem, right? So one of the examples that I've shared with Mick, and I think I shared in a piece that was posted on Climate Salad, is climate system stability requires a very large amount of emissions to be reduced as quickly as possible. I don't see anything happening in the investment space that places a premium on companies, even Catalyst, you know, Breakthrough. You know, I advise the Robert Downey Group. I know those guys very, very well. I don't see anybody making the connection between the key elements, right? How do we, right? Is there a chance that we're going to see, I mean, that Blackbird and these leading investors like your firm are going to start thinking about ensuring that we're actually addressing the problem? Because frankly, I don't see it yet.
What would some examples be of, like, you know, if you were in my shoes, what would you put money into which would truly address the problem?
Yeah, so I mean, methane, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk about a whole new global effort and targets around methane. I don't really care about targets or reports or meetings, right? But reducing methane and investments in reducing methane from gas pipeline leaks and everything else, that's one where you can get a huge return very quickly in terms of improving climate stability. Now, the problem is that you can make money doing that, but not the same kind of money you can make with SaaS, right? So unless the market can assign, we have to move to a market that assigns a premium to climate stability investments, right? Because if I'm a VC and I can invest in 2 guys and 4 girls writing code all night, right? As opposed to a company with hardware that's going to be chasing, you know, gas pipeline leakage, for example, or looking at creative. I'm going to go the SaaS route, right? I mean, but if that methane opportunity attracts a premium because there's a climate stability premium, then SaaS doesn't look as good, right?
So I would say there probably is increasingly a climate premium stability, only because there are so many thematic funds that are cropping up around decarbonization. So, you know, the risk actually is like stuff's getting funded that won't end up working out, won't end up scaling, because there's a lot of capital sloshing around looking for those innovations. So that's, I don't know if necessarily, I guess my point is also that it doesn't really start with investors. Like we have the privilege of working with founders who are going out and you know, identifying real market needs and building solutions for them. And so I'd say it's a little bit of a chicken egg problem and a flywheel opportunity, in the sense that if you have meaningful policy commitments to say methane as an alternative, energy source, or turning waste methane into energy, whatever you might be getting at in terms of the technology you're thinking of. If you have meaningful policy decisions that support that, then you also have customers who are private entities or public entities who want those solutions and pull them. Then the startups will be formed that will create solutions that those companies and governments will want. So I don't know if you can start with innovation. I think that's probably been the frustration of the last, you know, call it 5 or 10 years ago, where it's like, you know, we have this great solution. It acts in this part of the economy to make it more efficient, but no one wants it yet because they're not being forced to want it. And so it's a little bit of like a flywheel that's required to get spinning for the push and pull to start happening. And it does feel like it's happening in many areas. There are probably some that you're thinking about where progress is too slow. And it's an interesting question to ask. What is the unlock there? Is having a good solution to you know, XYZ thing enough for it to be adopted? Or do you actually need this kind of actor or this kind of actor to actually want it for that to scale. I think it does ultimately come back to customers. Who's going to pay for this innovation? Why do they pay for it? And how do you create the conditions where it's a no-brainer for them to buy the solution that's better? And that's not something that startups themselves necessarily can create the conditions in the abstract.
Yeah, look, I didn't mean to suggest that the solution has to start with you guys, with Blackbird, right? And I realize there's an ecosystem there. I believe, though, a climate stability premium in the absence of that, it's not going to happen. Now, there's lots of ways you can do that through policy intervention, right? That's certainly a solution. But if Mark Carney's point about, the greatest source of systemic risk to capital markets is climate change, and McKinsey's Global Institute says it's north of $50 trillion in unpriced climate risk and transition physical risk across, capital market balance sheets, then it seems this doesn't seem to be a difficult problem, right? Because you have $50 trillion of risk to monetize through that climate stability premium. So I've got a startup that's trying to do that, right? Build the algorithms that look at investments and ask the question, to what extent do those investments improve our climate stability chances, right? And then work towards trying to assign a premium to that. But anyway, listen, thanks. I very much appreciate your comments.
I think it goes also to Rachel's question in the chat, which is to actually get the end impact, you need multiple things to work out. The technology needs to be there. It needs to solve the problem. There needs to be a sustainable business model, which could be governments funding it, like governments have subsidized and funded things for public good, cleaning up the Pacific Ocean from plastics. Who's the customer for that? But there is also, it does need almost, and sorry, then it needs to scale. So there's multiple hard things, and if you take away any one of them, it doesn't work. Like it won't have the impact. And I think that's the challenge to Michael and Rachel's point, which is there's a lot of really complex things. And I think also to Kate's point, the fact that we actually don't have a return on impact number, like Blackbird, with all of Phoebe's experience, Blackbird is still working that out. It's not like, well, we need 18% IRR on impact, and we don't have a carbon price. Like there's a lot of these things which are making that just an extra little bit harder. But I also don't think you can artificially inflate any of those areas or skip any of them. Like, well, we don't have a product that solves a problem. Let's just scale something. Or here's a product that no customers will buy. It's not ready yet. Just give them $20 million. Like it's really, you've got to kind of got to trust the process. But I think to Michael's point about the impatience of like, what if the process takes too long? Like there's just that overarching thing, and there's lots happening in methane, but they all feel like, come on, go. So it's a tough. The flywheel one is really, really interesting to think about, Phoebe, and I'd love even to know if you feel anxious or optimistic, or there's more work to be done. Like, how do you feel when you get the sense of that?
Yeah, I think being in the investing side of it it's a balm, because you're working with people who have such big vision and such innovative approaches, and you're always mostly having very positive conversations about new things that are going to, make the world better. And so it's easier maybe to ignore the gnawing, looming sense of doom that everyone faces in this space. Actually, there's an interesting book that's just been published by John Wiseman. I don't know if anyone's read this, about, I think it's The Courage to Hope, something like that, in the face of climate change. It brings a lot of different kind of philosophical and, different approaches to thinking about climate change as an existential threat and so on. I don't have a good answer to that.
It is hard. I nearly every day I go through pangs of optimism and anxiety, but I'll pick up on Andrew's question here about what are some of the things you're seeing which maybe in Michael's and Rachel's direction, which aren't so mainstream and look like they're harder but have potential. Is there any like exciting areas or companies you're seeing which you think are like, well, that's new and could change things dramatically?
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting which I kind of said already, is that it's almost that you're seeing founders now bring a sustainability approach to areas of the economy that didn't benefit from that. And so it's not necessarily, one shiny technology, but more kind of rethinking paradigms in different parts of the economy. So I think Bardi in our portfolio is an interesting one where this is starting from first principles around food waste and thinking like, how can you turn, actually in like maybe a methane play is also a relevant way to use that waste, but the whole kind of circular economy, what waste outputs are being created that can be turned into something better. This is an idea that LanzaTech actually achieved really great success with in a period where there were probably many companies that had those ideas of taking waste streams and producing valuable outputs and weren't able to scale them. So Bardi takes food waste, feeds it to maggots, and very efficiently uses the waste products from those maggots and on-sells them in a carbon negative fashion. But, if you took a methane play where you take brewery offcuts and feed them into an anaerobic digester that's very efficient and create methane gas or generate electricity from that, it's a kind of another paradigm applied to the same problem of like these industries, supermarkets or breweries or dairy farms generate a lot of waste. And importantly to this, like the flywheel comment, they have a problem. Like dairy farmers don't want to be net contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. They really want solutions that will help them reduce their footprint. More than ever now, they may actually be at a point where they would buy an on-site anaerobic digester and be a contributor to a green methane production system. So is there a way that, with another piece of the puzzle, like government subsidy or something, you can make that whole setup that's never before existed, a new customer relationship, a new contributor to the energy system that's never existed? Can you make that a reality? That's kind of what I mean. We're like, you can have the greatest technology to plug into that supply chain, but it's not going to scale unless customers, whether they're dairy farmers or brewery owners or supermarket owners, see a problem, feel the pain, want to grab a solution, and that technology costs exists, which will make that a reality. So I guess what I'm excited by are almost known technologies where the customer segments that want to buy them are opening up. And that applies to everything from those sort of examples, but also through, the Phoebes and sun-fed meats and DAOs, where it's really about converting the mainstream consumer to eating a lower greenhouse gas emission diet, and opening new customer segments through kind of innovation rather than just necessarily creating brand new things.
Yeah. I think you're right about it being permeating in all parts. And Kate's made the point about the Dairy Australia's hiring climate change people. So it is touching all these things. When you see a company and you see with tremendous potential, like I look like an energy bank doing deep sea energy generation and storage potentially, and then it also kind of it's like it would benefit from 5 other technologies in terms of getting the energy out of there, dealing with waves in the ocean. Like I remember, the technology platforms we have today in SaaS are built on microchips, storage, bandwidth. Like there's been improvements on so many different areas which have exponentially helped each other. Is it okay for you to say, hey, here's an amazing startup. The world in which they are brilliant and scalable and solving all the problems doesn't exist yet, but in 3 years' time, we'll all be there? Like, do you feel it's okay to have that faith, or it's like that's risk on risk on risk?
Yeah, hard to say in the abstract, but definitely understanding what pieces of a technology design are novel and which exist and can be repurposed is important. I think, I can't remember, was it Mike who was saying to us the other day that, like, as long as you understand the constraints of biology, physics, and chemistry, and the thing is possible, then what's probably more important in my mind is understanding the customer need, because as long as you're like not trying to do something that's scientifically off the table, and you have this kind of market demand, of course that's simplistic, but those are the most important pieces, and then you kind of figure out how to get from A to B if you can.
Yeah.
But you're right, like, and I don't have great examples. Maybe something like the cost of photovoltaic cells, things like that. There are some big enabling technologies where so there will be certain tipping points around cost down curves of inputs.
Yeah.
Maybe on the cell ag stuff, it's the growth medium. Maybe it's like how quickly could the regulatory pathway be carved out so that new entrants can slide along it way quicker. Things like that are probably some good examples that others have in mind.
Dave's asked a question about Climeworks, and I'm pretty sure they're the carbon capture and storage in Iceland. That's correct? And so they're a company, right, which is it basically works, but is crazy expensive. You've got to buy into almost the same cost drop of solar and wind. Like, is that a company like, no problems, the demand's going to be there, we've got to take it out of or are you like, I don't, the physics is too complex, I can't get there? Like, how do you think about those big areas?
I don't know enough about the technology to say definitively, but it's an interesting, what the question it raises in my mind is how defensible is their technology and their physics and their, like, again, like back to sort of, are they putting together commodity elements, and how long could they protect the combination of those commodity elements? Actually be better for the world if all of that was not very defensible and lots of similar companies could spring up and serve our global carbon capture needs. In fact, should that even be a private company? Maybe they should just give it away. No.
Open source models in this area are going to be really interesting, right? Like,
it's a good point, because maybe what we learn from solar is that you can't, like, at a certain point you can't own the technology, and it's more important to be almost like back to the customer. If you're the consumer interface that helps finance solar installations on US rooftops, you are in a much better place to build an enduring, valuable business, because you control a customer relationship and you plug kind of commodity technology into that. So I think what's, again, interesting is not just to focus on the technology, but to understand, like, how is it going to get to market? What sort of moat could the company build around the customer relationship and the product proposition, not just the underlying technology, because we hope that actually a lot of these technologies are going to commoditize in a massive way, because otherwise we're all screwed. So
yes. It's a funny combination of being really deliberate about creating good tech and good teams and good businesses, but also I think to a lot of people's points here, like, but do more of it and hurry the hell up. It's a kind of again, if we're optimizing the banking systems, it'd be like, it takes 20 years, who cares? But we're talking about really, stuff we should have done 20 years ago. So totally understand. We're getting close to time, and what I'd love everyone to do is to turn on their videos if they feel okay. We're going to get a quick screenshot. And Phoebe, I'm going to put you directly on the spot and ask you if you have a favorite salad that we can put in the chat as well, in the blog post about this as well. I haven't prepared you for this, but it's a climate salad question. So I've got
an actual salad, or is this like a salad we can make at home?
You can make a theoretical salad. It can be a physics or a fusion-based salad. I'm open. Like, let's get creative.
Should I put it in the chat?
Well, no, tell us. Like, what's your
my go-to? I'm guessing I actually should describe a salad. So rocket, parmesan, toasted walnuts, thinly sliced pear, and then dressing of like a garlic clove, balsamic or white balsamic, and olive oil. Can't beat it.
That escalated fast to some really deep salad knowledge there. I'm really, really impressed. So everybody give me your favorite thumbs up, V symbol, or so whatever. I'm going to get a quick screenshot as we say thank you to Phoebe. So I'm going thumbs up. Perfect. Phoebe, thanks so much for sharing with everybody today. Everyone, thank you for jumping on. I appreciate it. We'll post this up on the Climate Salad website. Jump in, share your news, get involved, support these startups, keep buying products, carry your keep cups, eat salads. And thanks everyone for your hard work in climate tech. We really appreciate everything you're doing. So thanks team, and thanks Phoebe so much for sharing.
Thank you. Ka kite anō.